This story is about the mechanism that, with a practiced gesture, transforms crime into respectable business. About money whose smell and nationality are erased as easily as dust is wiped from a banknote. I will not tell you about villains in cloaks. I will tell you about gentlemen in frock coats who, in the quiet of London's offices, coldly decided to monetize the human weakness of others. And it is that decision which determines how you pay for your coffee this morning. Imagine the world's greatest empire on the brink of bankruptcy. Silver is draining from its vaults at the speed of a mountain river in flood, and the reason for this collapse sounds almost comical: tea. An entire nation has become addicted to a hot beverage from the other side of the world, and it has nothing to offer in return. Its factory goods are unwanted where the seller lives. And then the question is raised in the offices that will turn world history upside down. If there is no silver, what will compel the East to trade with us? The answer will ripen under the scorching sun of Bengal, in the form of white, milky sap seeping from the scored heads of poppy flowers. At stake is not merely the profit of one trading house. At stake is the very foundation of the future world economy. That same foundation upon which skyscrapers and transcontinental railways, banking systems and stock exchange algorithms will later rise. One man in Canton will try with his bare hands to stop this machine. One Scotsman in Hong Kong will figure out how to ensure that no one ever stops it again. Less than 30 years will pass between these two men, and in that time the world will become unrecognizable. I want to pose a question to which I myself have no easy answer. What matters more? The law of the country, under which the importation of poison is a crime punishable by death, or the law of the market, under which the inviolability of private property stands above all morality? Think about this before we go further. Listen, this story is precisely about that. Look at this gleaming monolith, the headquarters of HSBC in Hong Kong. For most people, this is the embodiment of financial power, a temple of modern capital made of glass and steel, reaching toward the future. But I ask you to do something more than simply look. I ask you to change your lens. Imagine this gleaming facade beginning to crumble. The steel melts, the glass dissolves into acrid smoke, the skyscraper vanishes, and before you is no longer a business district, but Humen Beach, in 20,000 date, where mountains of confiscated opium burn under the open sky. This is not an artistic metaphor. This is the foundation. What we have come to call the modern banking system did not grow from the honest savings of virtuous entrepreneurs. It rose from the ashes of one of the most sweeping criminal operations in human history. You may decide that events 2 centuries old have nothing to do with you. This is a dangerous misconception, because right now, when you pay by card for your coffee or transfer money through a banking app, you are using financial protocols originally designed to launder the proceeds of drug cartels. You think of the banking system as a neutral instrument. In reality, it is a weapon. Failure to understand this turns you into a naive player at a table where the cards were marked before you were born. We live in a reality engineered by smugglers, and the price of your ignorance is your personal financial freedom. In the next hour, we will do what the authors of school textbooks dare not do: perform an autopsy of the global economy. I will show you the authentic engineering blueprint of the modern world, in which respectable globalism is nothing other than a mutated drug trafficking scheme from the 19th century. We will trace the path from the poisonous poppy in the fields of Bengal to the digital algorithms of Wall Street. Forget the romance of sailing ships and noble gentlemen. Prepare to see history as a chain of cynical transactions in which morality invariably lost out to the profit margin. To understand exactly how this worked, we need to travel back 200 years to a damp, drafty London, where the great empire stood on the edge of bankruptcy because of one utterly absurd reason. London, 1820. A thick coal smog hangs over the city, And if you were to look at the situation through the eyes of the chief treasurer of the Bank of England, you would see not triumph, but panic. The vaulted cellars echo with emptiness. Gold is catastrophically scarce. Silver has almost entirely run out. The desk is piled with unpaid bills, threatening to topple the economy of the world's most powerful state. The reason for this collapse sounds ridiculous. Tea. Imagine the scale of this dependency. By the early 19th century, Britain was purchasing 28 million pounds of tea from China annually, almost 3.0 tons of dried leaves. For the Englishman, tea had long since ceased to be an occasional beverage. It had become the fuel of the working class, the sole relief in the breaks between shifts at the Manchester factories. Yet the Qing Empire, mistress of tea, dictated harsh terms. The Chinese refused to accept paper money, checks, or bills of exchange. They demanded payment exclusively in full-weight hard silver. And this metal drained from London at the speed of a mountain river in flood. The economic trap lay in the fact that Britain simply had nothing to offer in return. English merchants tried to sell woolen fabrics in China, but in the subtropical climate of Guangzhou, they were wanted by no one. They brought complex mechanisms, clocks, scientific instruments. Chinese officials merely smiled politely, considering it all amusing trinkets of the barbarians. The trade balance was catastrophically skewed. Silver flowed east and settled there forever in the treasuries of the Forbidden City. By situation had reached a critical point. The outflow of silver had triggered a deflationary shock in Britain. The pound sterling was reeling, and the directors of the East India Company found themselves facing a stark dilemma. They governed half the world. They had a fleet, armies, technology, but they could not balance the ledger. The choice was either to admit defeat and abandon tea, which would inevitably have provoked a social explosion at home, or to find a commodity that China could not refuse. A commodity capable of cracking the closed market, not by the force of arms, but by the force of biological necessity. It was in the quiet of London's offices that the cynical question rang out that would change world history. If there is no silver, what will compel China to trade with us? The terrible answer was ripening literally under the scorching sun of Bengal. At this moment, a dreadful metamorphosis takes place in the offices of the City of London. Respectable gentlemen in frock coats, who had just been discussing stock prices and the weather, make a decision that will transform a state apparatus into the largest drug cartel in history. They understood, if demand does not exist, it must be created artificially at the level of physiology. The ideal commodity had to cause instant addiction, be consumed quickly, and be worth more than gold by weight. Here the logic of the market gave way entirely to the logic of the predator. This was not an impulse of a greedy merchant, but a cold, mathematically calibrated plan to save the national currency. The British Crown decided to monetize human weakness. Saving the civilized Western economy required the deliberate destruction of the human capital of the East, and ethics was discarded as an inefficient asset. The answer to the question of what exactly became that commodity was ripening, literally, under the open sky on the boundless fields of Bengal. Forget for a moment the cool banking halls. An economic historian gazing at these fields stretching to the horizon sees not merely flowers, but a gigantic biochemical factory under the open sky. Before him is the opium poppy, an elegant plant concealing within it a mechanism for the destruction of civilizations. Thousands of workers, like ants, methodically score the flower heads. A white milky sap oozes from the cuts. In the hot air, it instantly oxidizes and darkens, becoming a viscous black resin. This is the moment of alchemy, when botany becomes geopolitics, and the juice of a plant becomes currency. What you would have observed on those fields was neither a chaotic peasant trade nor a low-level shadow business. It was the strictest, perfectly calibrated state monopoly. The East India Company, which de facto governed India, prohibited the cultivation of poppy by anyone other than its licensed contractors, thereby creating the first instance in history of an entire country the size of half of Europe being repurposed as a narco-laboratory on an imperial scale. The scale of this operation staggers the imagination even today. Revenue from the sale of the black resin accounted, by various estimates, for up to 20% of the entire budget of the British Empire. Consider this figure. 1/5 of the economic might of the world's greatest power rested not on the steam engines of Manchester or the shipyards of Liverpool, but on the sticky sap of the poppy. By the flow of the drug had reached monstrous volumes, sordak nol chests per year, amounting to 2,500 tons of pure opium. Picture a freight train several kilometers long, packed to the top with concentrated poison, crossing a maritime border every year. But here the true British legal genius came into play, what might be called the double-bottom technology. How could the Crown sell hard drugs into a country where doing so was punishable by death, while maintaining the image of a civilized Christian nation? The answer? A brilliant scheme of outsourcing guilt. The company never transported opium to China on its own ships. Instead, the entire harvest was brought to Calcutta, where it was sold at perfectly legal state auctions. Officials officially washed their hands. We are selling an agricultural product, and the fact that private buyers load it onto armed clippers and smuggle it to Canton, that is their personal choice in risk. Let us be honest. Today's Mexican drug cartels are mere children in a sandbox compared to the managers of the East India Company. The cartels have gold-plated pistols and submarines, but the British had the Royal Navy, Parliament, the courts, and a banking system that ran like Swiss clockwork. This was the first corporate drug trafficking in history, protected by international law. The historian notices one further detail that fundamentally distinguished this business from ordinary crime: standardization. Every chest of opium, Patna or Malwa, had a standard weight and guaranteed quality, making it the world's first global narcotics brand. A trader in the dark alleyways of Guangzhou would buy British opium without a second glance, knowing that imperial quality would not let him down. This flow was directed at a single point: the nervous system of the Chinese population. Opium did not merely kill pain, it rewrote the chemistry of the brain, destroying the will to resist. You must understand the fundamental difference. This was not trade in the ordinary sense, where demand generates supply. Here supply, backed by the most powerful biological dependency, was forcibly creating a demand that could neither be satisfied nor stopped. It was here, among the poppy heads under the Bengal sun, that the primary capital was forming, capital that would soon outgrow the holds of wooden ships. This money, smelling of earth and blood, urgently required a new home, reliable, clean, and respectable. But before that home was built, its future owners would have to survive a confrontation with the man who almost stopped the entire machine. The Pearl River estuary is not merely a port, but a gigantic sluice through which the poison grown in India poured into the veins of the Middle Kingdom. The historian views this scene without the romantic aura of sailing ships. For him, it is a combat zone, where smuggling boats broke through China's coastal defenses every night, and the logistics of this invasion operated with the efficiency of a modern drug cartel. For a long time, the game was entirely one-sided. British flags covered the cargo, bribes opened the customs doors. But the system broke down. Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu arrives in Canton, and this is that rare moment in history when a single man of iron will tries with his own hands to stop the grinding wheels of the global economy. He does what Western diplomats considered physically impossible. He takes no bribes, not one, and takes the entire foreign quarter hostage. Commissioner Lin Zexu did not merely seize the goods. He demanded the full surrender of the cartel and achieved it. Western merchants, locked in their factories without food or servants, were forced to hand over their stocks. What happened next on the Humen coast, historians call the Boston Tea Party in reverse, but the scale is incomparable. This was not a political act, but the sanitary treatment of an entire civilization. In June, enormous trenches were dug along the coast. The opium was not merely burned in them, it was destroyed chemically, mixed with lime and salt water, so that no one could collect the remains. Consider the figure. Commissioner Lin Zexu destroyed more than 0 tons of pure British opium. Chess, whose value in today's terms is equivalent to the public burning of several billion dollars in cash. From Beijing's point of view, this was the triumph of law. From London's point of view, a declaration of war. But do not rush to think that Britain openly stood in defense of the drug traders. Here begins the most cynical part of the story. William Jardine, head of the trading house Jardine Matheson, the very man the Chinese nicknamed the iron-headed old rat, urgently departs for London with a ready plan for turning the situation upside down. In Parliament, he launches a brilliant and terrible lobbying campaign. He says nothing about opium. He says nothing about addiction. He uses a term sacred to every Briton: private property. His rhetoric is impeccable. The Chinese have confiscated the property of Her Majesty's subjects. If we tolerate this today, tomorrow they will seize our tea and silk. This was the first public relations campaign in history for laundering the pretext for a war. Parliament wavered. Many MPs understood that they were, in effect, defending smugglers. The young William Gladstone, the future Prime Minister, cried from the podium, "I am not aware of any war more unjust in its origin or more calculated to cover this country with permanent disgrace." But the lobbyists won by a margin of just 9 votes. The argument of profit outweighed the argument of conscience, and the squadron set sail eastward to teach China the rules of free trade. The trouble was that China was preparing to fight people. Instead, machines sailed to its shores. The British military squadron was approaching the shores of China, and what happened next was not a battle in the usual sense of the word. The flagship of the punitive expedition was the steamship Nemesis, the first all-metal ship in the history of the British Navy. For Chinese admirals accustomed to wooden junks, the sight of a black iron monster moving against the wind and current and belching smoke was literally beyond their grasp of reality. The encounter of the Nemesis with the Chinese fleet was not a battle, but an execution at point-blank range. The steamship moved into the shallows, where the heavy ships of the line could not follow, and methodically destroyed coastal fortifications and flotillas with Congreve rockets. We witness here the birth of modern asymmetric warfare, the triumph of the Industrial Revolution in service of the dirtiest goal imaginable. Chinese soldiers displayed feats of extraordinary courage, but bows and matchlock muskets are useless against rifled artillery and steam engines. The Nemesis did not merely sink ships. It shattered the myth of the Middle Kingdom's invincibility, dragged China out of the medieval era, and threw it under the wheels of the capitalist express. The irony lies in the terminology. In history textbooks, this is called the struggle to open markets. A forensic auditor would put it more precisely, a debt collection operation on a state scale. Britain used its military-industrial complex to recover debts for a private drug cartel, acting as hired muscle for an organization that today we would recognize as criminal. By resistance was broken, and the terms of peace were dictated not by diplomats, but by those very opium traders whose chests had been destroyed on Humen Beach. They presented their bill, and that bill contained one item that changed the map of the world forever. They no longer needed trading posts, they needed their own land. 29. August 1842. Aboard the warship Cornwallis. The cabin is stifling with the weight of military tunics in tension. Here the representatives of the Qing dynasty sign the document that in Chinese historiography will forever bear the name of the first unequal treaty, the Treaty of Nanking. For the economic historian, this moment is interesting not for the humiliation of China, but for what Britain demanded as its chief prize. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary was furious. He called the acquisition a barren island with hardly a house upon it, a bare rock covered in bird droppings on which nothing but fever would ever grow. And indeed, why would the mistress of the seas need a tiny mountainous island without fresh water or resources? The answer lies not in geography, but in jurisprudence. The British did not need land, they needed a legal anomaly. Hong Kong was the perfect gateway, a deep water harbor, sheltered from typhoons by mountains, capable of accommodating the entire Royal Navy, and crucially, only a few kilometers of strait separated the island from mainland China. That is the distance of a cannon shot, but in legal terms, an abyss between two worlds. British law applies here, and there, across the strait, Chinese prohibitions. The trading house of Jardine Matheson lobbied for the creation of what we today call a free economic zone, the world's first sovereign offshore. The idea was simple and cynical to the extreme: to establish a base where the storage of thousands of tons of opium was perfectly legal business under the protection of the British flag. The goods only became illegal at the moment of crossing the narrow strait, but that problem was handled by Chinese smugglers. In the text of the Treaty of Nanking, there is a phrase that sends a chill down any lawyer's spine. The island was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. Not a lease, not temporary use, a full alienation of sovereignty. From that moment, Hong Kong became a gigantic, impregnable warehouse, into which not a single Chinese official had the right to set foot to inspect the contents of the chests. We witnessed the birth of a new economic model. If previously trade depended on the mercy of the emperor, now it rested on the inviolability of private property, guaranteed by gunboats. Hong Kong became a membrane. Through it, opium flowed into China, and back out, as if through a filter, came clean, laundered silver. This was, perhaps, the most efficient machine for pumping national wealth in the history of humankind. On the bare rock that Lord Palmerston had called rubbish, the construction of a new world began, swift and merciless. The stench of rotting seaweed mingles with the smell of lime, and on the rocks where yesterday only seagulls nested, go-downs, enormous warehouse complexes, rise one after another. Construction proceeds around the clock. Workers die of malaria in their hundreds, but their places are immediately filled by new arrivals, for economic expediency invariably proves more valuable than human life. Victoria City grows not as a place to live, but as a functional appendage to the port. Hong Kong's paradox lay in its duality. By day it was a respectable colonial outpost. Judges in wigs, gentlemen at clubs, tea ceremonies. By night the harbor lived an entirely different life. Thousands of junks, swift as shadows, glided toward the mainland, loaded with black resin. The British administration turned a blind eye, since every chest of opium was taxed, supplementing the colony's budget and financing the construction of roads, hospitals, and schools. Drug trafficking did not hide in back alleys, it built cities. Revenue from opium sales formed the colony's budget, paid the police and the courts. A closed circle emerged in which an activity criminal in its essence financed the establishment of law and order. Hong Kong became the physical embodiment of the phrase, "Money has no smell," even when it smells of the sweet smoke of an opium den. By the mid-19th century, 3/4 of all China's foreign trade passed through this bare rock. The red lines of sea routes on the world map converged on a single point. But here a new problem arose that neither guns nor warehouses could solve: the problem of scale. The volumes of silver and bills of exchange had become so colossal that traditional methods of settlement began to slow the process. The money received for opium had to be transferred instantly to India for the purchase of the new harvest, and to London for the payment of dividends to shareholders. A week's delay meant the loss of a fortune. In the shadow of the warehouse go-downs, amid the noise of port laborers in the creak of masts, an idea began to ripen that would change the banking world forever. and one Scotsman took on the task of bringing it to life. We are in Hong Kong, in the stifling office of a shipping company. Outside, stevedores cry out as they handle another consignment of goods. And here, in the quiet of the office, the Scotsman Sutherland is writing the charter of an organization destined to outlast both the British Empire and the Qing dynasty. He is not a banker, he is a logistician, and this is precisely what will determine the enterprise's success. Sutherland saw what London's financiers were missing. Conventional banks operated in the old manner. Every decision on a large loan required approval from London, and while the letter made its way back and forth, 6 months would pass. In the drugs business, where prices changed daily, such slowness was equivalent to death. Sutherland proposed a revolutionary idea: to create a bank whose brain was located here, directly on the ground. So in 1659, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation was born, known to us today as HSBC. Examine the list of the bank's founding members. There are no random names there. This is not merely a gentleman's club. It is essentially the board of directors of a drug cartel that has decided to legalize its assets. One of the key figures was the representative of the trading house Dent and Company, the principal competitor of Jardine Matheson in the supply of opium, a fact that the bank's historians prefer to mention in passing. The financial foundation of this global institution was literally drenched in narco money. The paradox that must be grasped: HSBC was created not to hide money, but to accelerate it. Sutherland applied the principles of maritime logistics to finance. If previously a merchant carried silver from Canton to India at the risk of encountering pirates, now it sufficed to deposit the metal at a bank branch in Hong Kong and receive a paper bill of exchange. This paper, certified with the HSBC seal, was instantly accepted in Shanghai, Calcutta, and London as live money. The bank transformed heavy, dirty silver into light, liquid information. The velocity of capital turnover tripled. A person who had previously managed to complete 1 transaction per season now completed 3. But there was another, more cynical reason for the success. The bank became the perfect reputation laundering machine. The moment a silver dollar entered the HSBC teller window, it became anonymous. No one any longer asked whether this coin smelled of opium smoke or the sweat of a Chinese coolie. The bank issued in exchange clean, respectable banknotes, gladly accepted in the best houses of Europe. The Scottish origin of the founders played a decisive role here. Scots always stuck together as a clan and trusted their own more than official documents. This network of loyalty allowed the bank to operate with incredible flexibility, turning a blind eye to the origins of the capital of clients within the inner circle. The official legend holds that the bank was created to finance trade in tea and silk. This is a beautiful lie. The statistics are inexorable. In the bank's early years, the lion's share of foreign exchange operations in the region fell to the servicing of the opium traffic. Without narco money, this financial giant would simply have starved to death in infancy. Sutherland created not merely a bank, but a sovereign financial ecosystem. HSBC began printing its own banknotes, which in China were valued more highly than the money of the emperor himself. Imagine the level of this power. A private corporation run by drug traffickers was effectively issuing the currency upon which the economy of an enormous region depended. Here lies the root of modern offshore banking. The principle was simple. Profit is generated where there are no taxes and no inconvenient questions, and then pumped back to the metropolis in the form of clean investments. Opium burned in the pipes of China's poor, turning to ash, but its value did not vanish. Through the mechanisms of the bank, it crystallized into Victorian mansions, into the steel of railways, and into political influence in Westminster. Death was converted into progress. And this money did not remain lying in vaults. It set off to build a new world. For the forensic auditor Accustomed to tracking suspicious transactions in the SWIFT system, the archives of the 19th century look disturbingly familiar. Silver extracted through blood and addiction in Asia made a quantum leap across the oceans. Heavy coins received from Chinese smugglers settled in the vaults of Hong Kong and Shanghai, and at the other end of the world in London, they were instantly transformed into impeccable pounds sterling by means of a banker's bill. This was the first global money laundering scheme in history, even though the very term did not yet exist. From the perspective of a professor of economics, you are witnessing the greatest act of financial alchemy, the dirty, toxic profit from selling a drug that destroyed families in Canton passed through the membrane of the bank and emerged on the other side as sterile, clean investments in human progress. Where did this money go? The answer to this question forces a reconsideration of the map of modern civilization. The opium profit, converted through HSBC, financed the laying of the rails of America's transcontinental railroad, the steel backbone of the American economy, a symbol of freedom and westward expansion. Textbooks rarely mention where the liquidity for this titanic project came from. Every spite driven into a tie somewhere in Utah or Nevada has an invisible connection to a chest of opium sold in the port of Guangzhou. Capital has a memory, and a competent auditor always traces it back to its source. Look at the Sassoon family, the bankers of the East, as they were known in financial circles. The principal beneficiaries of the opium trade and key shareholders in HSBC, they embody the perfect example of the social rehabilitation of capital. In the first generation, traffickers in a prohibited substance. In the second, respected philanthropists. In the third, lords of England sitting in the house. The banking system was that very washing machine which rinsed the criminal trace from money. The Sassoons and their partners used the HSBC infrastructure to transfer enormous sums into London real estate, buying up mansions in fashionable districts and financing political parties. Opium revenue became the foundation of British high society in the Victorian era. By the end of the 19th century, opium accounted for 0.08% of all revenue of the colonial administration in India. This was not a slush fund or a side income for corrupt officials, but a systemic budget-forming line item. All this massive money needed legalization, which the banking sector graciously provided. A modern anti-money laundering expert would recognize in HSBC's actions of that era the classic layering scheme. Money was fragmented, transferred between trading house accounts, mixed with legitimate proceeds from the sale of silk and tea, until its origins became completely indistinguishable. This was a masterclass by whose textbooks the modern shadow economy still operates. Globalization did not begin with the trade in smartphones or with the internet. It began when Scottish bankers understood how to transform a local human tragedy into a global investment resource, by building a bridge between the hell of opium dens and the paradise of Victorian prosperity. We still walk across that bridge today, not suspecting what its supports are made of. It seemed as though this perfect mechanism would operate forever. Money flowed, trains ran, the empire grew wealthy. But on the horizon loomed a threat that no one could have predicted, not even the most far-sighted directors of the bank. At the beginning of the 20th century, the international community finally outlawed opium. At the bank's headquarters, chaos was expected. It never came. Instead, cold calculation prevailed. Formally, the commodity disappeared from declarations, but the need to move enormous amounts of capital recorded nowhere remained, and the bankers understood the key truth. Prohibition does not destroy a market, it merely raises the risk premium. The structure created to service the drug trade was not dismantled, it simply went underground, changing its signs and its terminology. In place of physical chests of opium, toxic assets and the money of sanctioned regimes began to flow through the bank's channels. The DNA of a corporation tuned to operating in the gray zone proved remarkably resilient. If in the 19th century they circumvented China's customs cordons, in the 20th and 21st centuries, they learned to circumvent the financial monitoring algorithms of the United States. This thesis ceased to be conspiracy theory in 2012, when the United States Senate published a devastating 330-page report that reads like a crime novel. The documents expose what had long seemed impossible in the digital world. The bank HSBC had for years been functioning as the principal laundromat for Mexican drug cartels. History had come full circle. A century and a half after the Opium Wars, the money from drug sales had returned to the same vaults. View the situation through the eyes of a financial investigations specialist. In the bank's Mexican branches, the teller windows were specially widened to fit the boxes stuffed with cash dollars. This is not a metaphor, it is a fact from the case materials. Drug traffickers of the Sinaloa cartel brought in the proceeds literally in bags, and the bank's system accepted them without a single unnecessary question. There was no program malfunction here. This was a working business model, inherited from the Scottish founders. The case was not about drugs alone. The audit showed that the bank had systematically processed transactions for states under strict sanctions, including Iran, Libya, Sudan, and Myanmar. To prevent these transfers from being blocked by the automated system in New York, bank employees applied a method known as stripping or scrubbing. They manually removed from the fields of SWIFT messages any mention of the sender's country, converting the blood money of dictatorships into an anonymous electronic stream. The scale of the operations staggers the imagination. We are speaking of tens of billions of dollars flowing through correspondent accounts in the United States. The banking network, spread across the world like an old colonial web, allowed funds to be moved faster than regulators could notice suspicious activity. This was the same efficiency of which the bank's directors had been so proud in the era of the sailing clippers, except now it ran at the speed of fiber optic cable. When the evidence became irrefutable, the reaction that followed speaks volumes about the modern hierarchy of power. The bank, HSBC, agreed to pay a fine of $10 billion. To the average person, this figure sounds astronomical, but for a financial giant of this scale, it was merely 5 weeks' worth of profit. 5 weeks. That is the price of a decade of laundering the money of narco-mafias and terrorists. The most terrifying aspect of this investigation is not the size of the fine, but its consequences for the people who made the decisions. Not a single senior bank executive went to prison. Not a single director was put in handcuffs. Instead of criminal prosecution, a deferred prosecution agreement was applied. In the legal world, this is the equivalent of an indulgence. Pay the money, promise to reform processes, and the state closes its eyes to past sins. In the corridors of Washington, this decision was explained by the concept of too big to jail. Treasury analysts feared that revoking the license of such a giant could bring down the entire global financial system, triggering a crisis worse than 2008. The bank had become such a systemically significant node of the global economy that its criminal activity had become the guarantee of its own immunity. The share price rose after the announcement of the deal with justice. The market sent a clear signal. The bank's ability to work with dirty money is not a bug, but a competitive advantage for which investors are prepared to pay a premium. The modern forensic auditor sees in this a direct generational continuity. The layering methods by which flows are fragmented and tangled were not invented by computer algorithms. They were worked out by hand in Canton and Bombay when opium was exchanged for silver, silver for bills, and bills for tea. The technologies have changed, but the logic of laundering remains the same. Convert criminal income into respectable capital before anyone manages to ask a question about its origins. The architecture of managed ignorance, under which the head office in London could always throw up its hands and claim ignorance of what was happening in the Mexican or Iranian subsidiary, this is not a management failure. It is a brilliant construction, refined in the 19th century. The 2012 scandal was supposed to be the point of no return, the end of the era of impunity. But was it? To answer this question honestly, we need to step back from individual cases and look at the global map of the world, not through the eyes of a tourist, but through those of an investigator searching for a systemic pattern. Step back and overlay the map of modern offshore zones on the map of the coal stations and naval bases of the British Empire circa the 19th century. The overlap will be almost 100%. The Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, Gibraltar, Hong Kong, Singapore, these are not a random scattering of resort islands. This is the skeleton of the old imperial logistics. Those very ports where Kilinde years ago, clippers topped up their coal and water before the dash to China, have today become the nodes where capital sheds its tax burden and changes its legal skin. We have come to think of offshore zones as simply places with low taxes. This is a dangerous oversimplification. The principal export product of these jurisdictions is not a zero tax rate, but British common law, that very legal shell created in the Victorian era for the protection of colonial traders. It is this that today guarantees the inviolability of assets. The legislation of these islands is written to conceal the ultimate beneficial owner more securely than any cryptographic key. According to International Monetary Fund data, more than 3% of all the world's private capital passes through these former imperial outposts. A third of the planet's wealth circulates in zones historically created as gray havens for circumventing the restrictions of Qing China and other sovereign states. This system did not arise spontaneously in the internet age. It was designed by hand when messages were transmitted by Morse code. The concept of Know Your Customer, KYC, which today frightens small businesses, is a historically late novelty, an anomaly. For 11 years, the banking system sold its clients precisely the opposite, anonymity. The very idea of banking secrecy in its modern form was refined precisely at the time when the respected lords of London needed to receive income from the opium plantations of Bengal, without soiling their hands and reputation with direct participation in transactions. The key instrument of this system became the trust, a legal fiction that allows the separation of formal ownership from the receipt of benefit. This is perhaps the most cynical invention of Anglo-Saxon law. It permits the owner to say, "This is not my money, I do not own it," and continue to enjoy all the advantages of the capital. The irony is that the mechanism created by medieval knights to protect their lands during the Crusades proved perfectly suited to the drug lords, dictators, and corrupt officials of the 21st century. The central node of this web remains Hong Kong. Its role has not changed since only the types of transactions have changed. It continues to function as the perfect gateway membrane. On one side, authoritarian China with rigid currency controls. On the other, the open global market. Hong Kong is the only place where these two incompatible systems can safely touch, converting political power into hard currency and back again. Economists call this construction the Second British Empire. When London physically lost its colonies, it preserved them financially. Instead of governors and garrisons, control is now provided by the Big Four accounting firms and the branches of banks like HSBC. This is the invisible empire, where the sun truly never sets, because when the exchange closes in the Caymans, it is already opening in Singapore. We mistakenly believe that globalization is a process of opening borders. In reality, what we call globalization is the scaling of the East India Company's business model across the entire planet. The free movement of capital without the free movement of accountability. The offshore map proves it. The modern economy was not built from scratch on principles of transparency. It was constructed on top of the old smuggling routes. Sailing ships were simply replaced by fiber optic cables. Attempts to reform this system are doomed to fail because it is not broken, It works exactly as its architects, the Scottish merchants and bankers of the Victorian era, intended. The offshore zone is not a bug of global capitalism. It is its motherboard. And every time you hear about the fight against money laundering, remember, you are watching bees fight against honey. The very architecture of international finance was created so that money would lose its smell and its nationality. Now look at the screen. Before you is the nocturnal panorama of Victoria Harbor in Hong Kong. The water here is dark and dense, like oil, and above it rises the headquarters of HSBC. This building, designed by a renowned British architect, is considered a masterpiece of high tech. But if you look closely at the logo on its facade, at that red and white hexagon, you will see not merely a corporate brand. This is the stylized flag of the trading house that years ago raised its sails to carry death in exchange for silver. That banner was never lowered. It was simply digitized. We began this investigation with a question about tea and a silver deficit, and arrived at a diagnosis of modern civilization. What historians timidly call commercial expansion was in fact the first successful attempt in history to build a global economy on the foundation of organized crime. The British Empire proved a terrible theorem. If drug trafficking is sufficiently large in scale, it ceases to be crime and becomes sovereign macroeconomics. The Opium Wars did not end in the 19th century. They simply changed their form. Instead of cannonballs, credit ratings are now used, and in place of opium, cheap loans that provoke the same destructive addiction. The story of the Sassoon family and the bank's founders teaches us a cynical but important lesson about the nature of elites. Respectability is simply a matter of time and a successful laundering of one's biography. Yesterday's drug lord becomes today's Lord of England and patron of the arts if he manages to convert black resin into bank shares in time. This is the law of primitive capital accumulation, which glossy textbooks do not discuss. The boundary between a pirate and a banker runs not along moral principles, but along the level of access to legislative power that allows one to rewrite the rules of the game in one's own favor. The 2012 scandal, a fine of $1 billion for laundering narco-cartel money, was a moment of truth. This sum, equivalent to merely 5 weeks of the bank's operating profit, is not a punishment. It is a tax, a commission for doing business in the gray zone. The system acknowledged that it cannot exist without shadow turnover. The gray zone is not a bug of the system, not an error. It is its load-bearing structure. The most dangerous illusion we must shed is the belief in the neutrality of money. We are accustomed to thinking that a dollar, a pound, or a yuan has no memory. But every time you make an instant transfer across the ocean, you are using communication channels laid on top of the old opium routes. The speed of which we are so proud was paid for with the lives of millions of Chinese peasants, whose dependency financed the Industrial Revolution of the West. In the foundations of Europe's railways, New York's skyscrapers, and the universities of the Ivy League lies an invisible but indelible layer. Commissioner Zexu burned 1,000 tons of British opium on Humen Beach.